I didn't have the pleasure of turning the pages because I read it in PDF and I've made extensive notes, which I will be quoting. What I would like to do is hold the book up and show you how dog-eared it is so you know that I really read it. But you're going to have to just go with the quotes I've got. And I'm going to try to make this a good enough interview so that at some point your publisher will send me a hard copy. But I guess Princeton is publishing it in October.
October 8th, yeah.
Yeah, and the only regret I have is that you've written a book that a lot of people can read, and of course, an academic press sends a signal that actually is unfair to your book, and that is that this is somehow an academic book. And while I think you've got all the academic chops, it's not only accessible, it's beautifully written. And I hope that we can find ways, I say we, because I'm very much on your team here. I love the book,
Oh, thank you.
to get the word out that your book is phenomenally accessible, as amongst other things, and we'll get to that. So let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Musa al-Gharbi, and Musa is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. Musa's book, We Have Never Been Woke, the culture contradictions of a new elite, will be published in October 8, 2024 by Princeton University. And I just want to add, if we have your permission, Musa, we'd also like to make it our November selection for our book club. It has to be read, which means we can re-promote it and offer it online and hopefully get you a few extra sales that way, if that's good with you.
Absolutely. If you shoot me a note, we can probably get you a discount code as well so that people who participate in the book club can purchase the book at a discount.
Good.
That would be great.
Well, when we're all done here and I sign off, please stay on the line, as it were, to use the old terminology, so that you can talk to my producer, Ernie, and do two things. First, get the details down on how we can promote you, the book, all the sites you want to link to, talk about the book club, and also pick your brain if there's some other guest or guests that you feel would be great to interview. And that we might not otherwise think of, and they don't have to be famous or authors or anything else, just people we should be talking to. So if you would do me the favor, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Okay, so I want to talk about your book, and I'm going to go to some of the pages of quotes I have here. We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, is a book on how a new, quote, woke elite uses the language of social justice to gain more power and status without helping the marginalized and the disadvantaged. And as I introduced you as a sociologist, it's worth noting that before that, you were a philosopher and, of course, still are one, but your background is philosophy. You have a very interesting bio, and we can get into some of that. The only point of reference, I would say, when you open your book with the stories about being on the Upper West Side in New York and the disconnect between the Black Lives Matter protests and the people out on the street who are homeless and Black, and here are these predominantly white liberal protesters sort of moving homeless people aside as if they're in the way of their protest about Black lives. It kind of struck a chord with me in the sense that after 9/11, my son John volunteered for the Marine Corps right out of a swanky private high school. He was the first person to volunteer for the military in that school's recent history. And I noticed an interesting thing, that for some reason, that story at the beginning of your book brought up something with me. And that is, I live on the swanky North Shore of Boston in what I call the Volvo driving, higher education worshiping elite of our area, very much the kind of people you describe, and I include myself in that, just as you do in your book, which, by the way, is so fair-minded. It's not pointing the finger at the other. It's like, hey, we're all in this together. But I was so struck by the fact that from that moment on, back in 1999, when he volunteered, and then after 9/11, when he was at war in Afghanistan, he served twice there and once in Iraq as an enlisted Marine, that I didn't know anybody whose son was in the war. They were going shopping, they were doing this, they were doing that. And I began to feel much closer to the waitress at a diner that my wife and I go to for breakfast than I did to any of my swanky friends who teach in places like Harvard and all the rest of it. And for some reason, I had a very visceral connection from the moment your book starts in this other environment, thinking, yeah, I get this. Because for a moment in our lives, we were of the people, not of the elite. Our son was getting shot at, and the people who were watching his back, some of them learned English in boot camp. They were from Hispanic backgrounds, and they could hardly speak English when they volunteered. And I felt a lot closer to their parents, the parents of those guys, than I did to the people who supposedly were, more like me or looked like me. Yeah. That's a weird place to start talking about your book. It's a personal thing, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the transitions that I didn't talk about in the book, but that was also another thing that I wrestled with a little bit, is because until 2016, I lived in a military community. So it was the case that a lot of my childhood friends, a lot of my family members had gone to war. I mean, in my case, military going back generations, like my grandfather fought in World War II and then Korea and then Vietnam. Yeah. On my mother's side. On my father's side, my father was in the Middle East during Operation Desert Shield, helping coordinate NATO operations from Turkey, and Storm as well for that. And so it was, it was a very different environment to move to the Upper West Side, where there were not many people. There were a lot of people who had very strong views about foreign policy issues, but not a lot of people who had skin in the game or kind of meaningful knowledge or in that way. And and so that was a big adjustment. It's a different vibe.
It is different
in these kind of knowledge economy spheres in that way.
Yeah, and another point of connection you and I have, and I've read every word of your book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough, and I'm going to be quoting from it, and we'll discuss individual pieces of it, but just to kind of an overall observation, when I got to your bit on Calvinism and how the Calvinist work ethic had permeated an entire cycle of development economically, mostly with people these days who wouldn't know who John Calvin was, let alone having read the Institutes or anything else, it struck a chord, because this conversation, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background so that we can connect on a couple levels, and then we'll dive into your book. I was raised in a small evangelical white mission in Switzerland, of all places, in the 1950s and 60s. My father's an evangelist and theologian. I left that background and I've moved to a very secular place in my life, I guess, compared to how I was raised. But, we were outsiders. We were American, weird, religious freaks on the edge of a tiny Swiss village, and we were accepted about as much as, I don't know who it would be you could make a comparison with, but I know about being an outsider. And then I was sent to a British boarding school, having, homeschooling, having failed miserably, which I ran away from a second British boarding school, got married as a teenager, had 3 kids by the time my friends were finishing college, was a nepotistic sidekick of my evangelist father on the religious right for a while, left that. But the thing I want to say about your book, and I'm setting it up with my own little narrative here, is that I sort of regard myself as a bit of an outsider observing. And I would just say, and I know this sounds strange, but if Alexis de Tocqueville came back now and observed America as it is now, he would be writing your book. I feel that you have written a fair book, and the voice is one who, not as an outsider, but who is scrupulously fair to the left, right, in the middle. You identify with the groups you are not, I won't even say criticizing, but trying to report on, which is this kind of woke movement that you see, interestingly, as both phenomena of the left and the right. Yeah. So anyway, I just want to tell you that I connect so powerfully with your book on so many levels, and to me, it's a very high compliment to someone to say, you're the Alexis de Tocqueville at this moment. You bring
immense praise.
You bring a clarity to your work that I have not experienced before when it comes to reporting on contemporary issues, because everybody has this axe to grind, and it's like, what planet did you come from? Because here's an academically sound, beautifully written narrative about our present moment in history, And it's almost as if you're writing from the point of view of 100 years from now. This reads like a history of our moment without the usual snarling dog in the fight, if I can put it that way. So I was really surprised because I kept running into things in the book saying, wait a minute. I thought this was a critique of the woke movement, but now he's looking at the right and understanding that the lens is the same, or that, all of a sudden you turn around and you shift your perspective. And I would just say that goes through the whole book. That's the way the book is. So I guess my first question to you before we dive into the book is going to be, how do you think this will be received by the powers that be, who are all very much the people you're talking about? I'm waiting for the New Yorker review and the New York Times. Either they're going to ignore it, or how will they deal with it? Because you've really got, and I won't say you've got our number. I mean, you've written a portrait of contemporary America and politics in it, and the woke thing is just a fraction of what you've written about. I don't know. How do you think this is going to go down?
Yeah, I'm intensely curious myself. I'm not sure. It could go, a lot of different ways. And I think, to your point, one of the things that I tried to do in the book, that I tried to keep in mind as I was writing the book, is that my big goal wasn't to tear anyone down or help some faction win or some faction lose. I was trying to just tell the truth, and then kind of let the chips fall where they may. And I tried to keep that in the foreground of my own brain as I was developing the piece. And I'll say, like, part of the fair-mindedness as well is a product of the fact that this was an academic, is a product of the fact that because it's an academic press book, one, that kind of forces me to write in a different way because it has to get peer reviewed and to pass peer review. And the people who are peer reviewers are as you noted, are the very people who the book is about. And so I had to be thoughtful in that way. And then I got really thoughtful feedback from the peer reviewers and the other people, the people who were on my committee at Columbia, where I was going to school at the time, and so on. That really made the work a lot stronger. I mean, there's a lot to hate about peer review. There's a lot that people fairly criticize about peer review. But when the system works, it really does make the work stronger. And I think, and here I think I do have to take my hat off to some of to the other people who gave me great feedback throughout the process that really helped it strike that balance, I think.
Yeah, I think I see the book on the shelf behind you.
Yes.
Could you just haul it off? Because like I say, I've read the thing. And I like, just make the front, there we are. We have never been woke. It's really, really something. Read the title to us in the subtitle.
Yeah, the book is called "We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite."
Yeah, and now we're going to dive in. I forget where I pulled this from, but I'm reading, I think this comes from the end of your book. To put it simply, the fact that symbolic capitalists have never been woke reveals a lot about us. It says much less, however, about the framework and the ideas we appropriate and often deform in our power struggles. ... Sort of condensing here. On the whole, this deep dive into history, culture, and political economy of symbolic capitalists sharpened, by the way, those words, symbolic capitalists, that's what you call us all, left and right. Yes. We're symbolic capitalists, and the book explains it, and I'll get to that in a minute. Sharpened my conviction that growing inequality, the rise of Trump and Trumpian politicians and social movements, the, quote, crisis of expertise and rising tensions around, quote, identity politics are all part of the same basic story. See, this is where your book is so different. It's not a left-right issue. It's a bigger story of what you're calling symbolic capitalists. And this is me talking, not the book. And now back to your book. They're fronts in an overarching struggle between symbolic capitalists and those who feel unrepresented in their social order. Again, just brilliant. This is de Tocqueville speaking here. Again, this is a struggle that is playing out not just in the United States, but mutandis within many other countries as well. This conflict between symbolic capitalists and the unrepresented, will likely dominate my scholarly attention in the months and years to come. So that's part of your conclusion. And then you go on and say, analyzing symbolic capitalists in these terms, perhaps we really do want the poor to be uplifted. We want the oppressed to be liberated. We want the marginalized to be integrated. However, we'd prefer to find a way to achieve these goals without having to sacrifice anything personally or change anything about our own lives and aspirations. And I picked that out to introduce the book with, because I think it sort of wraps up the intent of the book. And also, just let's go to this thing about this terminology, the capitalist terminology you're using. Explain that a little bit, because that's sort of, you use it throughout the book hundreds and hundreds of times, and I just want people to understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, so the core idea of symbolic capital was developed by this other sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. And basically what he argued is that symbolic capital are the different ways that folks rely on to justify inequalities, to make them seem normal and appropriate and reasonable. And so he came up with three different types of symbolic capital. So one of them was academic capital, which is when we try to get other people to do what we want, to follow our lead, to defer to us based on the credentials that we hold or based on our association with institutions. So, if I say, well, if I'm arguing with someone and I'm like, well, I'm an expert in blah, or I'm a professor at Stony Brook University, or, I write for the New York Times or something like that. These are examples of academic capital.
Sure.
So we're deploying and then there's political capital, which is when we try to get other people to do what we want, to defer to our needs based on the kind of the role we hold in an organization. So like, you should listen to me because I'm a manager, or because of a reputation that you developed as someone who gets things done, who makes things happen, and so on. So it's getting other people to listen to us, to do what we want, to defer to us for those reasons. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when you convince other people to listen to you, to defer to you, because other people admire you or respect you, or they think you're interesting and cool and sophisticated, and they want you to like them, or they just want to make you happy. And basically, Bourdieu argued these three forms of symbolic capital are what help us reproduce the social order. They're what help us legitimize inequality. They're what make us defer to people of our own volition, even when they don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. And in the book, the reason I call the people I'm talking about, the reason I call us symbolic capitalists, is because basically the way we make a living, the way we're basically oriented around kind of what we know, who we know, and how we're known. So we basically leverage social symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people, and that's basically what a lot of what our main job description is. And so people who work in fields like science and technology, or finance, or consulting, or academia, the media, nonprofit organizations, and so on, are all examples of people who are symbolic capitalists. People who are not working in jobs where they are providing physical goods and services to people are typically symbolic capitalists.
Yeah, and it's very much, people like you and me. And of course, one of the brilliant things of your book is you're not pointing the finger. And it's worth emphasizing this again. You're saying, no, this is us. This is the class from which I come, or at least I am part of now. And let's look at ourselves and understand that all our signaling of virtue and so forth does not translate to actually paying our nanny more, or looking at the actual Black guy on the street as we protest for Black Lives Matter and shove this Black homeless person out of the way because his trash bags and shopping cart are in the way of our protest. By the way, I had an apartment on the Upper West Side for about 10 years. And as a writer, my agent lived across the street, and publisher, and was there. And so, and I would be around the campus up there quite a bit in terms of Columbia. I had an interesting story from Columbia that I'll just share with you. When I told my wife, Jeannie, I was going to do this, she says, oh, make sure you tell him about John on Columbia. When John was still in Afghanistan fighting, we were applying to schools for him. when he would get back. And the least receptive of all the schools we applied to, because he had a good academic record, he could have gotten into a lot of places. So Jeannie was helping him with all this. And he was literally in combat. So she's getting him to write essays or answering questions on a satellite phone. But Columbia was very unhelpful. The fact he was a Marine meant that she got less help from their admissions people, to the point where they were really rude to her. And interestingly enough, the only school of that caliber that really reached out and said, we'll do anything we can to assist him, through his mom applying while he's in combat, interestingly enough, was the University of Chicago. So they sort of had this liberal idea of like, whatever. And he got in there and everything went very well and he did very well. But Columbia was like, no, and this was at the cool part of the war, when most people were still sort of thinking we should be in Afghanistan. This wasn't when it was all running out of steam. This is in like 2003 and 4. But it was an interesting experience. She was really put off by this sense of, no, you're not one of us. What he's doing is not cool on this campus. We're not gonna lift our finger to help your son get in here. I don't know if that rings a bell with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this is part of what symbolic capital does in practice, is it helps mark people as being insiders or outsiders, as being kind of amateurs or hacks, or people who belong or don't belong, or who should be listened to or shouldn't be listened to. And so and one of the big arguments of the book is that in practice, whether or not, if not by intent, in practice, a lot of times the social justice discourse that people learn in schools like Columbia, and that schools like Columbia expect. I included some quotes in the book from admissions officers at Yale who say things like, we expect our students to come here to be, engaged in social justice protests, and even if they have arrest records for that, it'll probably help you. Other arrest records, not so much. And and so one of the key things that these modes of talking and speaking and presenting yourself do is they help show elite gatekeepers on the admissions committees at Columbia, or at private K-12 schools, or if you're applying for a job at the Atlantic or some other mainstream news organization.
Sure.
If you show that you can execute the right scripts, that you have the right kinds of markers, that you then they become a lot more likely to hire you or admit you, or give you a platform and things like that. And so that's one of the big functions that symbolic capital has in practice. And so even and then actually this is one of the tensions that you see in America as a whole right now, that transcend class as we typically understand it. Because in a lot of communities around the world, around America, there are all sorts of people who are relatively affluent. Say they own a chain of car dealerships or grocery stores or something like this. So they have good money. They're not, they're in some cases millionaires even, right? But they don't have the right cultural capital. They don't have other forms of symbolic capital. And so they're not taken seriously. They don't have the kind of prestige they feel like they should have on the basis of their class. Their kids are sometimes disadvantaged in competitions for elite spaces relative to other people who might have less money, but are kind of more,
they're cooler.
tied to, absolutely.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about, there's a very good section in your book about how the professions break down, how engineers or people who are in mining or energy acquisition, whatever, are sort of more toward the right, and then people who are in the knowledge class are toward the left, and how we love to pick on our billionaire 1%, because we can all agree they're awful, but actually, the real problem is sort of the attitudes of the people who are very well off, and at the same time won't change anything about their lifestyle when it comes to actually helping elevate anybody beyond sort of talking about it. You have numerous examples of that. But I want to read a little section here that could describe me as a progressive activist who comes out of Christianity, and a lot of the quote unquote progressive Christians I work with, far from being intellectually converted by intensive engagement with academic arguments, symbolic capitalists embrace, quote, wokeness, largely because it serves their interest to do so. They often encounter these social justice ideas in distorted and simplified form via secondary territory sources. They may genuinely believe in these ideas as they understand them. However, they generally interpret and mobilize these social justice discourses in ways that serve their interests. Critically, none of this entails that symbolic capitalists are cynical or insincere in their professed commitments to social justice. We tend to be, and I love the we again, it's we, you're not pointing the finger, we tend to be true believers. However, these beliefs rarely translated into behavioral changes or reallocation of material resources, in part because symbolic capitalists tend to hold political priorities and embrace modes of political engagement that diverge substantially from those of most other Americans and encourage an idiosyncratic approach to social justice advocacy. And of course, this applies to our present moment in history as Trump's running for power again. He is a con artist. He's an awful human being. I can speak categorically on that. And he has fooled a lot of people who really are members of a cult. But there's a whole nother group that are just so fucking pissed off with the way they have been disregarded for so long, not in the usual sense of that Fox News talks about, but in the sense that they know perfectly well that value signaling has not done anything to lift them. And they have been ignored, and they know he's a con artist, but they also like the revenge part of his program, as in, we're going to stick it to these assholes that come and tell us how to behave, but have done nothing for us.
Yeah.
And I think your book is brilliant on that. I mean, as an aside, people are always asking me in the media, explain these evangelicals who vote for Trump because he's immoral and all the rest. They don't get it, but you totally get what the real attraction is there. They're just so sick of these kind of value signaling people who call themselves liberals, but actually live high off the hog and never change their lifestyle for anything, including, say, energy policy they talk about, whatever. So just talk about that aspect of hypocrisy for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think that drives a lot of this anger and resentment in some cases is that it's not just the case that we talk a big game about social justice, but then don't follow through, don't put skin in the game, don't make any sacrifices or changes ourselves and try to take from other people. So it's not just that. Like one of the really grating things is, I think for a lot of people, certainly one of the things that started to stand out for me and that I started to find disturbing as I thought about the themes and subjects, started doing research, is that increasingly social justice discourse is actually used to justify inequalities, to explain why the people who are losing and who are the losers in the knowledge economy deserve their suffering, deserve to be excluded. So for instance, there's empirical research that shows when you teach people about white privilege, the idea that white people are all born with inherent advantages that non-white people don't have. When you teach people about white privilege, it doesn't usually lead them to treat non-white people any differently. It doesn't lead them to even think about non-white people any differently. The main effect that it has is it causes people to think a lot more poorly of less affluent whites. It causes them to think that poor white people deserve their poverty and probably have more than they have for failing to make good use of their privilege. Oh, you were born with all this privilege. Why aren't you successful like me? Oh, it must be because you're terrible with money and a bad person and so on. So you deserve your poverty and your suffering. And similarly with, you can tell a similar story with respect to gender. So when you look at a lot of the trends, a lot of the measures you would use to look at social misery. So people, men rank much higher than women. And the trend lines are all in really adverse directions. They're becoming much less likely to live independently, to hold steady employment, to graduate from college, to get married, to have children, and in part because the kinds of professions that men have typically worked in, where they're providing physical goods and services to people, or things like that, like traditional industry, agriculture, so on, are disfavored and in favor of the symbolic profession. So they've been kind of the losers in a deep sense. A lot of men have been kind of the losers in this shift from more material economy to symbolic economy. but a lot of the stories that we tell in social justice spaces about men and their evils and the patriarchy and stuff like this makes it difficult for a lot of symbolic capitalists to really care about the suffering, the growing suffering among men. That
well, in addition to which, you throw in the whole gender issue. You're a white male, cisgender, whatever, however it's described, you're the least sympathetic person. Of course, the symbolic capitalists are still in charge and mostly white and so forth and so on. And they are going into the knowledge class and they're doing, what are called the creatives. I hate that term, by the way. We're all creative. But, you make such a good point of painting a picture that somehow these are all just new forms of exclusion. Nothing really has been accomplished. We just cite these folks. And then, of course, because you also are a very able historian and you look at really where we all come from, you go through a kind of a picture of in terms of the history. And of course, this naivete that somehow puts the blame on the white male, as if somehow, brown males are better, or that other periods of history that were sort of different. That's an aspect of your book that I love, because you have a very broad kind of historical vision. So, you mentioned gender. How would you place this sort of attitude toward, there's race, you write about that, and you write about gender, and you write about the economics and feminism and so on. But it seems that if you were talking to a lot of the people who support Trump and you would say, where did you totally get off the boat? For instance, I was reading an article recently, I forget, maybe from the Atlantic or New York Times Magazine, whatever, last week, about how more young males are now involved with evangelical Christianity than young women are. The women have sort of parted company, but the young men are looking for something because they've kind of been, especially white young men, not only alienated, but pushed aside. And this whole new generation, statistically is siding more with Trump now than their female counterparts of the same generation or even the same educational level. I think this all has something to do with what you've been writing about. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to understand the growing gender divide is in part because is in part looking at kind of which industries men and women, what type of career and life paths men and women tend to be tied to. So there's this growing divergence in this dimension as well. And actually, there's this interesting phenomenon in the social sciences called the gender egalitarianism paradox, which is namely that in cultural contexts and economic contexts where you have more opportunity and more diverse sets of opportunities for women, the differences between men and women actually get bigger rather than smaller. So the idea that a lot of people have in their minds is that maybe if you move from a context where there are not a lot of opportunities for women, where women can't get access to a lot of jobs, then as you increase them, then women will move more into the male jobs, and the gaps between men and women will shrink. In fact, they often grow more pronounced, in part because when women have a greater range of choices and options, they often choose to gravitate towards jobs that are also dominated by other women, and men also make a similar kind of calculation where they often prefer types of work and lines of work that end up working with other men. And so the gaps between men and women in terms of the type of work they do and the types of social circles that they're enmeshed in, and even a lot of cultural things about like how men and women present themselves in terms of their political alignments, all of this tend to grow larger rather than smaller in a world where say women don't have as many options, and the only paths to good life are to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, for instance. Then you see a lot of you see women and men following similar paths, and so they end up actually closer when you look at across education levels. But in our society and a lot of peer societies, instead you see kind of this growing divergence that's driven in no small part because women are increasingly aligning themselves with the symbolic professions, whereas men are often finding a difficult time fitting in there, or persisting in there, and are gravitating towards other jobs or being underemployed or unemployed.
Yeah, just take 1 second and then I want to reintroduce you. Define symbolic professions.
Yeah, so the symbolic professions are where people are working with basically they're manipulating ideas and data and images and symbols instead of, again, providing physical goods and services to people. So they're not cutting people's hair or stocking shelves or delivering people food or something like that. They're manipulating symbols and data and ideas and stuff like that.
Which is a huge section of our upper crusty culture now. This is Frank Schaeffer. You're listening and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Musa al-Gharbi. And Musa is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism, speaking of those professions, at Stony Brook University. Musa's book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, will be published on October 8th, and you can pre-order it, I think, already by Princeton University Press. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And this book, by the way, will be our November selection on our book club. It has to be read, and we'll have links to everything to do with the book and this conversation. I'm going to just go back to the book here, read a little something to talk about. Sometimes consciously, often in the background, symbolic capitalists are aware of the dissonance between their legitimizing narratives and their lifestyles and behaviors in the world. All manner of mental gymnastics and displacement are therefore required to allow us to see ourselves as, quote, good people, as worthy of the station we might inhabit in society, as the solution to social problems, rather than being part of the problem, as exceptions to the rule relative to other, quote, privileged people, as being on the, quote, right side of history, and so on. These efforts are only, at best, partially successful. We can see this in the social fact that people most likely embrace, quote, woke views, that is, the winners, quote, in the social order are also far more likely than most other Americans to suffer from anxiety and depression. Imposter syndrome is widespread as well, afflicting an estimated 2/3 of symbolic capitalists. I just think that's such an interesting point, kind of a little insight and window into what you're saying in general, if you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so here I think, one struggle that I had myself, honestly, is that so before I was a fancy nerd, I was, as I note in the book, I was selling shoes. I was selling shoes at Dillard's, which is like the southern version of Macy's for people who are not familiar.
And you were good at it.
I was good. I was great. I met my wife at Dillard's. Actually, I sold her shoes. This is how we met each other. But so the thing about selling shoes is, people come in and they need shoes. Shoes are something you need. You need shoes. You maybe don't need 70 pair of shoes like some of my customers do. But in general, people need shoes. So people would come into the store every day and they would have problems. They would have they would have tangible problems. My kid is starting school. He needs some shoes that are his size. I'm starting a new exercise regimen. I need some shoes to try running so I can get into shape. I'm getting married. I need some shoes that go with this dress, and so on. Yeah. So they would come in with concrete problems. I would help them solve their problems. I wasn't out changing the structure of society or getting into cosmic battles or changing the world or anything like that. But when I punched out every day, I spent all day helping people. I spent all day helping people with little real problems that they had in their life. And I basically never feel that way in my current job. Despite my increased prominence, my much higher pay, it's just not the case on most days. And in fact, even for things like academic work, I hope that this book is impactful, but one of the disturbing things I realized as I was doing research on how much the typical academic work reaches, how many people get reached by academic work or journalistic work. So there's a section in the book called Tempest in a Teapot that brings together a lot of these statistics. One of the things I realized is that, if an alien came down to Earth and they had an electromagnetic pulse, and they eliminated like the bottom 95% of all academic research that's been published, none of us would even know the difference. Like life would go on, no one would know, because the vast majority of the work we do just frankly doesn't matter. A lot of it's just wrong, like factually wrong, but even when it's true, it's trivial. Well,
you
so,
cite one paper where, you give yourself as an example of someone who wrote this convoluted analysis of one person's work analyzing another person's work, and you said you did a pretty good job, but who cares,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so I think, I think a lot of us are aware on some level, a lot of people who work in academia and media and other things like this are aware on some level that the work we do, if we didn't do it, the world would chug along. Whereas if people stopped preparing and serving food, stopped watching our children, stopped driving us around or fixing cars or things like that, if other workers stopped doing the kind of work they do, not only would we notice it immediately, but we wouldn't be able to function in a meaningful, it would require us to dramatically change our lives, assuming we could survive at all. And so I think this awareness that a lot of us hold in the back of our minds that we try to bury and suppress, so
and maybe resent a little bit,
absolutely resent a little bit, so that we can, in our attempts to feel like we deserve the money that we get relative to those people, the status that we hold relative to those people, because we get a lot more pay, a lot more money, and we're doing work that at the end of the day, if we didn't do it, it wouldn't matter. Whereas they're doing work, and that's one of the things that they resent about us as well, because it's not lost on these other workers that the work they do is actually matters. Whereas a lot of the work we do doesn't, but they see us living much better lives. We get a lot more pay, a lot more prestige, a lot more status, more comfortable working conditions, and for what? For what?
And they also see that they are invisible to you.
Yes,
and of course, then when somebody really angry comes along as a populist candidate and says, "I'll help you get even with these assholes," it's like, okay, you're a jerk, but sign me up. I'm done with these people.
Yeah, it's not only that they're typically invisible, and they are, as I highlight in the intro to the book, powerfully at Columbia, for instance. But when we do notice them, so they're typically invisible to us. But when we do notice them, the things we have to say and our modes of engagement with them are often really terrible, frankly terrible. We engage with them in ways that are sneering and condescending, and that exacerbate the resentment they already feel, and if anything, affirm the picture that people like Trump or other people paint of us. We often embody the caricature ourselves in ways that are really damaging.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get into something I'll readdress here, but one of the things is this a phenomena of once in a while, some academic person does get noticed, maybe a philosopher who says there's no such thing as gender, and all of a sudden, they're lending credibility to a very kind of rarefied theory that annoys the vast majority of humans on this planet. And then all of a sudden, one of the mysteries to me that isn't addressed directly in your book, but as an example, but I think I'd like to go there with you now for a minute, is what is it about the knowledge class, the purveyors of information that do matter, for instance, the editorial board of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, whomever it may be, right or left, that they sometimes gravitate towards theories that come out of academia on things like gender, and suddenly this becomes the new thing. The average person in the street is going along doing their own thing, driving a cab or picking up the garbage or cleaning our dishes or tending our children, whatever it may be. When they become aware of these ideas, it's sort of always like a fait accompli. Hey, no, this is what the professional knowledge class has agreed is true. Deal with it, change your vocabulary, catch up or get out. We didn't think much of you to begin with, but now if you don't admit that cisgender, this, that, or the other, or the pronoun, the level of annoyance and aggravation that comes out of this tiny fringe of academic people, and I won't even call them the left or right, it's more than that, when it does percolate into society in general, whether it's being misunderstood or not, that's a different question. I think a lot of people who vote, for the Democratic Party have underestimated by a quantum factor the annoyance that this stuff has been causing like a dripping faucet for a very long time. And the fact that nobody seems ready to stand up and correct that, is very apparent to me in private discussions with people, some of whom are notable on the left, who say, well, I can't go there, but we don't want to mention this because it might give credence to the other side. And after all, Trump is worse, blah, 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 blah. So we can't even talk about this. But in private, I'm putting my daughter in a private school that doesn't do this because I'm sick of having her to answer questions about gender to her. So she's in a Catholic school now.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing from some liberal activists who helped found a big liberal group 20 years ago. Even they are bailing, but the wisdom of a certain cohort in the media and the professional classes is, look, we can't question this stuff. It's been handed down. Now to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is striking about symbolic capitalists is that the story that we tell ourselves about, what makes us different from other people, we say, we're just independently minded and we think rationally and come to our own conclusions. And, we look at workplaces like Google and they have not a lot of structure, they don't have deadlines and they're not being watched by their supervisor in aggressive ways and they can come and go as they please and all of this. Yeah. And we think, oh, well, what we say is the reason why our workplaces are structured that way is because we can't be controlled in that way. You can't hurt us. We're cats. We're not sheep, right?
Right.
And so, but one thing that's striking and that I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about is that there is part of the reason why our workplaces are structured this way is actually because you don't need to supervise us. We supervise ourselves and we supervise our peers in this very aggressive way. We're really conformist. So when you look at a lot of the dynamics that are popular and that take hold in symbolic capitalist spaces, like people blowing up, becoming a big thing all of a sudden out of nowhere, or getting canceled, that is becoming nothing, also in an equally rapid way.
Well, taking all our revenge on one Karen for decades of racism, this kind of thing.
Absolutely. So these aren't things that you would expect. You wouldn't be able to see these big cancellation campaigns and people going viral and blowing up and all of this in contexts where everyone is making up their minds independently through a careful deliberation of the facts and all of this kind of stories that instead, these are dynamics that tend to take hold when people are just immediately copying their peers without a lot of thought. That's how you get cancellation campaigns and people blowing up and going viral, is everyone's doing what their peers are doing immediately and reactively without really putting a lot of thought into it. And the reason why you see this happen in our spaces a lot is because the work that we do is so contingent on our social standing, on how other people perceive us and our relationships to other people. And so we have a lot seems to be at stake with whether or not we stay in everyone's good graces and impress the right people and say and do the right things. And so we tend to be a lot more kind of conformist in this way, a lot more, kind of status oriented in this way. And so it's really easy when the right people in the right institutions with the right kind of power, people that we want to impress or emulate or copy or have other people associate us with, when they say jump, we say jump, 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 jump. Yeah, like we do the same thing. So it's you see this kind of hegemony in a lot of symbolic capitalist spaces.
Yeah, I mean, we're all free thinkers. We just all happen to freely think exactly the same thoughts.
Yes. And
and I love the way you reference Orwell all through it, because of course, half of this could be taken out of Animal Farm or whatever. It's all great stuff. Hey, I want to read something here. By 2020, highly educated white liberals, this is from your conclusion chapter. By 2020, highly educated white liberals tended to provide more woke responses to racial questions than the average Black or Hispanic person. They tended to perceive much more racism against minorities than most minorities themselves reported experiencing. They expressed greater support for diversity than most Black or Hispanic. White Democrats also became significantly more likely to perceive others in their social circles as, quote, racist, even as non-white co-partisans moved in the opposite direction. Then later, why are growing numbers of working class, racial, and ethnic minority and religious minority voters, quote, voting against their interests, end quote, as we tend to see it, and aligning with the political right? And then another little piece here, practically speaking, what, if anything, might be done to escape the sociopolitical and cultural doom loop we seem to be trapped in? Those are separate little pieces, but they all kind of add up to one thing here that I think is worth talking about. So we've talked a little about kind of the sort of gender dysfunction in kind of trying to make this one size fits all terminology. Race is another area that you zero in on. But again, I just want to tell people, when you do read this book, you'll see that he brings a very hard, sharp lens to how the right conforms to the same pattern. This is not a criticism of the left from a right wing. No, it's an overview. The reason I'm zeroing in on these passages here is in the spirit of your book of talking to ourselves here, because my audience tends to be more from the left. So let's concentrate on a little self-criticism here, which, if there's any lesson from your book, that's what we all need to do a lot more of, or we're just going to be in this doom loop perpetually. Okay, so please hold the emails saying, if you're going to have a thing like this on your show, I'm canceling you. I mean, then we will have fulfilled exactly what we're talking about today. Okay, go ahead. A little bit on the racial thing.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the, what's interesting, as I show in a lot of my research, even outside the book, is that there's this interesting phenomenon where most journalists and academics are on the blue lines of charts. And so if we want to understand kind of the growing gap between the red and blue lines, we don't usually focus on the blue line. We don't ask ourselves, like, why are we so weird? Why are we shifting so much? We just assume that the reason the gap is growing is because those red line people are growing more extreme, even when in some cases they're not. So if you look at trends among Republicans, for instance, although they are annoyed with a lot of wokeness and stuff, they're not actually getting more racist or sexist or any of this kind of stuff. Even like, take the case of evangelicals. If you look at the attitudes of evangelicals towards questions like women in leadership today versus in the past, if you look at evangelical openness to homosexual relationships today versus in the past, there's no comparison. If you compare the data from the 1970s to the data of 2020, contemporary evangelicals are much more progressive than they basically ever have been on a lot of these cultural issues. But the reason that the gap between evangelicals and everyone else is growing is not because evangelicals have been getting more and more and more extreme right-wing. It's because other factions of the Democratic Party have become really extreme left. And so they, even when people are shifting in the same direction, because they're shifting at different rates, the gap can grow. And we often uncharitably assume it's because those people are getting more extreme and so on. When they're not, we're getting extreme. We're getting, and you can see this play out in a lot of the trends with non-white voters and with religious minorities. There's a narrative that, for instance, Trump won in 2016 by appealing to racism and white supremacy and so on. And, don't get me started on Trump's rhetoric, but the bottom line is, when you look at whose votes actually shifted, white turnout in 2016 was stagnant, so Trump didn't mobilize a bunch of white people to the ballot box. There was not, and Trump got the same share of the white vote as Mitt Romney, actually got a slightly smaller share than Mitt Romney did in 2012. That is, whites were slightly less enthusiastic about Trump than they were Romney. So why did he win in 2016? Well, because of shifts among non-white voters, Trump got a bigger share of the Black vote, of the Hispanic vote, of the Asian vote than Romney did. And that helped flip important states like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia, allowing him to win the Electoral College and the presidency. And then over the course of the last decade, in fact, what I show in some of my research is this alienation of non-white voters from the Democratic Party actually predates Trump. It started after 2011. So around the same time that symbolic capitalists started to get especially woke, non-white voters started to flee the Democratic Party.
Well, you zero in on an aspect of this. I think it's on page 65 where you say there is compelling empirical evidence that highly educated, relatively affluent, religiously unaffiliated white liberals are increasingly leaning on politics to replace religion. Polls and surveys consistently show that non-religious and irreligious Americans are the most politically involved groups in the country, participating in many political activities at a rate double that of white evangelicals. And of course, that's directly related to what you're just saying. And there's this sort of weird idea, I talk with a lot of people who are on the left on this show, but also just in my life, because I'm sort of there myself politically. And one thing that always strikes me is the naivete of the people who thought that somehow the brown and the black vote was going to swell their numbers. And I kept saying, just wait 1 minute. I come from a Protestant background. You do realize that about a third of the people who have come in as immigrants from a Hispanic culture in Central and South America are fire-breathing Pentecostal evangelicals. They're not even evangelicals, they're charismatics. And you do realize this thing called the Black Church actually exists, and people still reference it. I mean, you understand that they are not carbon copies of you because you've said you're not a racist, and so somehow they're going to love you. The things they hold most dear, you don't even think about. You're just thinking in political terms. And I've been saying that to people. And your book, of course, you have this passage on religion. So talk a little bit about politics replacing religion. Forget whether religion has any value or not. Let's not do that right now. Let's just, because I'm sort of an atheist, but let's talk about this fact having direct political consequences in the North American context, where far from religion becoming irrelevant, because of our immigration patterns, religion is now a bigger deal than it was, say, in 1960. In the U.S., people look at these church attendance charts for white Christians and the kind of denominational differences between mainline Christianity and the more conservative things. What they're not looking at is this whole chart of people coming in of color who come from strong religious backgrounds, either first generation or a strong memory of. And I know you're very sensitive to this and write about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is even setting aside the Democrat-Republican implications of this. Even when we think about the ways that a lot of progressive institutions and individuals try to pursue social justice, one of the ways in which that project goes awry is that we don't attend to this point you just made, which is a very important point. So, like, when you look overall, non-white Americans, immigrant Americans, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, non-traditional students in colleges and universities, and so on, they're much more likely to be religious, to be socially or culturally conservative, and so on. And so in a lot of our knowledge economy spaces like higher ed and journalism and other fields, we create atmospheres that are hostile towards socially conservative or religious views. In the name of diversity and inclusion, we try to suppress religion. We try to push this really aggressive, progressive politics and say people who diverge from this are racist and sexist and all of this kind of stuff. Well, who's most likely to diverge? Actually, it's not relatively affluent white people. The relatively affluent white people are the people who are most likely to say the right thing. The people who are most likely to diverge are actually non-whites and poor people and immigrants and people like this. And in fact, we can see this in a lot of the data where when you make it easier, for instance, to fire people based on their political views, the people who end up getting canceled, who are most likely to get canceled, are actually women, non-whites, people of immigrant background and stuff like this.
Sure.
Or when you institute workplace grievance procedures where you can punish people and get them fired for saying the wrong thing or something like this, it turns out that when companies institute these grievance procedures, often in the name of social justice, what ends up happening is that non-white managers get fired. That's what happens. When you look at the data, there's no effect at all on white male managers. White female managers barely moves. It's managers who are women and men of color who get
the white managers have learned to say the right things.
Yes, They learn to say the right thing. They know what the right codes are. They know how to work the system. They know how the system works, and they know what they're supposed to say and do. It's people from non-traditional backgrounds who don't have that cultural capital, who don't have that these other forms of symbolic capital, and who also just in addition to not having the kind of symbolic capital, they also just don't agree. They don't agree with a lot of the dominant views. They don't agree with a lot of the, and so yeah, and a lot of times, because we don't pay attention to this, because a lot of times people on the left just assume, and one of the ways they get confused, frankly, is that they look at the fact that, say, that Black voters, as an example, tend to vote, at 5-1 for the Democratic Party or more, and so they assume, oh, well, then they must be the black people must be super liberal. Because the Democratic Party is the liberal party, Black people are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democrats. Therefore, Black people must be super liberal, super progressive. And if we do aggressively progressive and liberal things, Black people will love it. In truth, Black people are some of the most culturally conservative bloc of the Democratic Party. They're very skeptical of immigration. They have very significant public safety concerns, which makes sense. They have they're not fans of a lot of this stuff on gender and sexuality, and they've been alienated, and they've been moving to the Republican Party as the Democratic Party has leaned more heavily into this stuff at the expense of the bread and butter issues. Most Black voters, the reason why they have been aligned with the Democratic Party is because the Democrats have been perceived as better allies for basic civil rights, and they agree with things like government redistribution programs and having robust social safety nets and things like that. Yeah. But as the party shifted from being focused on these bread and butter issues and on kind of more core civil rights, like basic civil rights issues, into these really niche identitarian things, that's turned off a lot of Black voters, and they've been leaving the party. And it's not just Black voters. You see the same trends with Hispanics. You see the same trends with a lot of Arab and Muslim voters who are alienated by some of the cultural left stuff in places like Michigan, in states like Michigan. You can see. Well,
and I would think the same thing is true of some of our brilliant Asian folks who, you go down to MIT and people clearly are from India or someplace like that, and they're there getting their PhD in this or that or the other. They're from very what would be labeled by, your white woke liberal traditional family structures. They plan to get married and have children and do it when fertility is not a huge issue and so forth. It's been interesting to me in this podcast, and we've done hundreds of interviews with people, many, many authors and other people, that something is beginning to percolate. I'm not saying I take this as a sign of this or that or the other, but just speaking to your Tocqueville self, I'm sure you're aware of this, but for instance, Ruth Whitman, who is a British writer who writes for things like, I think, Vanity Fair and the New York Times and other publications that fit with your mold, has written a book called Boy Mom, and it's from the point of view of a liberal feminist, who's still a liberal feminist. She's not disavowing anything, who's saying, yeah, but I'm the mother of 3 sons. What about the boys? And, two feminist writers who have written this book called What Are Children For? Well, like if we're all freezing our eggs and waiting forever, what did we think was going to happen? I don't know. Have you noticed a little bit of a crack in the facade of self-doubt creeping into heretofore safe bastions, feminist authors and others who are saying, I don't know, we may have gone wrong here a little bit. And then on the other side, I've got Ruth Pakaluk, who's written this book, Hannah's Children, which is 50 interviews with 50 women, all who have chosen to have 5 or more kids. Every single one of them is religious, either Islamic, Jewish, Christian faiths. But she's saying they've chosen, and they all have PhDs. They all are highly educated women who have said, no, we're not doing this. We're not putting career ahead of human experience. Interesting. Yesterday, I emailed her a copy of the New Yorker review, and I was surprised by the reviewer, who, it wasn't your typical New Yorker review. We should get her to review your book. Who said, yeah, she sort of has a point, and she's going to have a hard time convincing women of this, but she's intelligent, she's articulate. So my question to you is, am I the only sympathetic interviewer you're going to have, or are there cracks in the facade of the certainty that has just been the assumed leftist position? We all know this, and okay, what's the new directive from this person or that person on gender, race, whatever it may be? Okay, we all fall in line. there's some people with real left-wing bona fides who are not falling in line now. I think we're all getting a little bit sick of the Orwellian directives from on high.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've argued in a essay that came out after the book was mostly written, so I couldn't fully include some of this data in the book. But looking at some of the same measures that you would look at to see that something changed after 2010, things like voting behavior or trends of coverage in news magazines or books and academic articles, and changes in protest activity and so on. It does seem that the kind of this period of great awakening that started after 2010 does seem to be winding down now. A lot of these trends seem to be on the decline after 2021, and you can even see this, by the way, with the Democratic Party today. So during the 2020 election, or even going back a little bit, like in 2012, I have this chart that I include in some of my talks that shows the Democratic and Republican Party platforms. And after 2012, the Democrat platform shifted radically to the left, while the Republican one didn't shift much at all. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton, ran this really wokish campaign where this scene like sticks in my brain, where she was running against Bernie Sanders, and she says something like, well, if we break up the big banks, is that going to end racism? Is that going to end sexism? And the crowd roared back, no. And of course, that's true. It wouldn't end racism. But then again, Hillary Clinton's policies also weren't going to end racism.
Right.
And then in 2020, I don't drink, but if you did a drinking game, every time Joe Biden and Kamala Harris said systemic racism in 2020, you would have been pretty
inebriated.
Yeah. But in the current cycle, you have Kamala Harris running. She would be the first female president. She would only be the second Black president, and so on. So she's a historic candidate. But you don't see her talking about identity. She's not leaning into gender stuff or race stuff too much. And so it seems like even she sees that there seems to, in the Democratic Party apparatus, I guess is better said, sees that there does seem to be some shift, this moderating trend that seems to be underway, and a lot of symbolic capitalists are less aggressively woke or whatever than they were, in the last cycles.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, truth or at least practicality will out from time to time. And, that, of course, is what I think your book is so strong in. And I just want to say again, we've been looking at the left through the lens of Musa's book here, but he has a very tough look at the right, whether it's the Saudi Arabian regime versus true Islam or whatever. You're going to find that you will, when you read the book, you're going to think, well, why weren't we talking about that? But because in the spirit of the book of self-criticism of me personally and others on this side, I just want to look here at something you say. It's not particularly revelatory to point out that symbolic capitalists are hypocrites. Everyone's a hypocrite. Almost by necessity, moral principles tend to be austere, categorical, and unchanging, while the world we navigate is full of ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, contingency, and dynamism. All of us are born into circumstances that are not of our own making. As agents, we are fallible in our judgments and limited in our powers. Overcoming our personal limitations requires cooperation and compromise. As a result of these factors, our lives and societies are typically far out of sync with our aspirations. However, this is not to say that the gulf between our professed ideals and our actions doesn't matter. On the contrary, the struggle to bring these realms into closer alignment is the core source of purpose and meaning in our lives. And there you speak more as a philosopher and almost a preacher. And again, you quote Jesus at one point saying, no, this is not what the church did in terms of taking on the worldly power and so forth. Let me talk about your own spiritual background for a bit of time here. I think you studied to be a priest at some point. You're a convert to Islam. You have a book that reads like a sermon on tolerance and dignity to the rest of us, whether we're right or left. You're very fair in everything. I think you have a real moral core. We don't get born necessarily that way. When I look at my own trajectory, I'm 72 now. I'm a father of 3 grown kids and a grandfather of 5. 3 of my grandchildren live across the street. I do childcare for them. you know, everything that I've learned about life that matters comes from human experience that could be shared by anybody in any circumstance in any period of history. And I just have that sense in your book that somehow you've allowed life to teach you as a human being first, and you've chosen that path above academic respectability, if I could put it that way. You seem to always vote, you know, when I read every passage of your book, you seem to vote for common human experience and an appeal to let that actually move us away from ideology. Am I imagining things?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's a very kind way of putting it, and I guess that's more or less how I would describe kind of my hope and my project in the book. Um, you know, yeah, I've been on quite a journey myself, from as you said, from Catholicism to atheism for a while to Islam. I've been on a big intellectual journey.
Mm.
As I mentioned in the book, I've studied a whole bunch of kind of restless intellectually in some ways, and more importantly, though, I think even 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 the fact that I'm a professor now and I write for the New York Times and all of this stuff, honestly, the reason why any of that stuff is true about me is because if it was just me, I could sit there eating white rice in a studio apartment every day, and what really changed my life in a profound way was meeting my wife and having her, this person that I deeply admired and respected, make to me, what seemed to be incomprehensible decision to kind of hitch herself to my rickety wagon. It was a very rickety wagon at the time. And then especially having kids, it completely transformed. I got 4 degrees in the following 5 years. I went from community college to the Ivy League, and more than that, because you have these people who depend on you and who need you, and these people who respect you and love you and make you a better person. So I think that's part of the story that you see in the book, and then the other part is, both working through the tragedy of my brother's death, which kind of changed my orientation towards politics, and gives me an acute sense of what's at stake in some of these discussions. It's people's lives, it's people's dignity, it's people's ability to. These aren't just abstract, arcane discussions. People live and die, and they starve and succeed, in part based on these decisions that we make as a society. And so, bearing in mind this point that there's a lot at stake in these discussions, pushes me in a way to where the kind of feel-good luxury sitting on the armchair, like feeling really self-righteous and engaging only with people who agree with me and so on, like that's a luxury that I just I understand the appeal, but it doesn't resonate with me. And to the extent that it ever did, frankly, getting canceled by Fox News and then the journey after that, where I responded to getting canceled by Fox by really especially because after I got canceled by Fox, I lost my academic job. I got rejected from all the PhD programs I applied to. I later tried to apply just as a manager at the shoe store I mentioned, and I got passed over because I was overqualified. And so I'm sitting here like wondering, like, how did my life come to this? Especially, and again, it was really anxiety inducing, both because hot dogging on the internet resulted in a lot of unnecessary difficulty for some of my colleagues, but then also unnecessary difficulty for my family, right? Because again, I had a wife, I had kids, and I wasn't. And so, as I was kind of working through this, I realized that one of the questions I was asking myself a lot is, why is it that so many people we're so willing to embrace the wild caricature of me that Fox News painted. And I realized that at least part of the problem was that people like me didn't really engage with people like them much at all. And when we did, it was in these really sneering, condescending kind of ways. And so I responded to getting canceled by Fox by trying to engage more with the right. So I started taking the same essays that I would publish in Al Jazeera or Salon or somewhere like that, and sending them to the National Review or the American Conservative and the New. And I didn't change anything about the argument. Like I didn't self-censor. I didn't say anything I didn't believe. I just changed the framing, changed how I talked about it to try to talk about it in a way that's. And not only were right-leaning outlets willing to publish it, but then my exchange with people who actually disagreed with me. When I'm not preaching to the choir, I'm preaching to the people who need to hear the message, in my view, engaging with those people and going through the process of like how to talk and think about this issue in a way that might actually be persuasive for people who don't already agree. This caused me to recognize a lot of kind of blind spots and biases in my own work. It also caused me to kind of reevaluate the value of my own work. Like if you want to try to convince people not to bomb Syria, it doesn't do any good to go to an outlet like Al Jazeera and say, don't bomb Syria. Everyone agrees bombing Syria is a bad idea. If you want to actually do anything that has any prospect of contributing to the outcome that you desire, you have to go to the people who do want to bomb Syria, and you have to explain to those people in a way that they'll actually find persuasive why bombing Syria might be a bad idea. And so now, when I do work, almost any of my public-facing work, I still write for right-leaning outlets and left-leaning outlets and a lot of everything in between. And basically what I try to do is tell audiences things that I think they need to hear but don't want to hear. And so this is what I do when I write for The Guardian or other left-leaning outlets. All of my work in left-leaning outlets are things that left-leaning readers are going to find often uncomfortable or difficult. But the same is true when I write for right-leaning outlets as well. And I think that this commitment to try to tell audiences these kinds of things both puts me in a position where I have to constantly kind of second guess myself or think more deeply about trying to convince other people. But also I think it's changed my life in the sense that the work that I do has had a lot more impact now. So this is one of the ways in which sometimes in our desire to be righteous or to kind of coalesce with people who already agree with us and condemn those people and so on and so forth, to the extent that we don't go where the fish are, to the extent that we're unwilling to extend basic charity and humility and things like this to people who disagree with us, that we operate on these really negative assumptions about those people and what they're motivated by. It actually makes it harder for us to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And if we think that the work that we do is important, as academics say, or journalists, or if we think that the causes that we subscribe to matter, then it's really incumbent on us, in my view, to try to try harder to reach people who don't already agree. But there are very few of these kind of big social causes and issues that progressives and others can reasonably achieve, speaking only to other people who already agree with them, without any buy-in at all from people who are not already on board. And so, and this is again, as I mentioned, this is a thing where the death of my brother really kind of weighs heavily, or kind of keeps this point in mind, that there's a lot at stake here, and if it matters, then it matters more than being self-righteous or making sure that no one could even possibly perceive me as maybe being right of center or anything like that.
What year? When was he? When was he killed?
In 2010.
And as I recall, that was in Afghanistan, I think.
Yeah. And it was just as it was just after I had finished. My wife and I had gotten married. I had just finally finished community college after 6 years of wandering, and we were getting ready to transfer to university. I was going to go to NYU, which had a lot of philosophers there. I was a philosopher at that time still. Had a lot of philosophers there whose work was like really interesting to me, and it was really well ranked and whatever.
Yeah.
But then in the aftermath of my brother's death, we decided to stay at University of Arizona so I could be close to my family and support my parents through this time. Yeah, so
and then you went off and got your PhD in this, that, and the other, didn't you? And that's what brought you to Columbia, I think.
Yeah. So and even there, so as I mentioned, the first time that I applied to PhD programs, I actually didn't get in anywhere because it was right after the Fox News scandal. And I was just going to, and then after I also got turned down, like I said, for the management job at the shoe place and stuff, I was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess the only thing for me actually is to just go into the family business and join the military. So I was gonna try to join as an officer. But then I had a mentor at University of Arizona who said, like, look, I think that you have a lot to offer as a scholar. I think you should give it another go. Here's the mistake that you made, she said. You applied to these schools that you thought were safe. They're not actually safe for someone like you because you're a weirdo on paper. Like, people don't know what to make of you. They don't know where you slot. And a lot of the less prestigious departments or whatever, the departments that don't have as many resources and stuff, what they're looking for is someone who fits cleanly into a box. They know what you're going to do. They have a good sense of what you're about. Especially, ideally, you would play cleanly to the department's existing strengths and so on and so forth. And so she said, for someone like you, what you'd probably want to do is just aim at the top schools because they're looking for, they're more open to weirdos. And if you could be the next big thing, or you could explode in a blaze of ignominy, they can roll the dice for that. They have huge endowments, multi-billion-dollar endowments. They can afford to roll the dice on people who might flame out.
And that worked.
It worked. I got in everywhere I applied the second round. I got into Yale. I got into Columbia. I got into life-changing.
I think with your book that's out now, and just grab it off the shelf again, read the title and hold it up one more time before we get out of here. I wish I had a copy, but I read mine read the title again, please.
Yeah, so the title is We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, and it's coming out October 8th with Princeton University Press.
Yeah, and Musa, we just need to hope and pray that whether it's audiobooks or Kindle or whatever, we eventually get into a way of distributing this book that people can get to and find approachable. I don't know what people say about you, but this book is my first exposure to you. I read an article by you, and so I sent it to my producer, Ernie, and we booked you because of the article. But I have to tell you, having read the book, I think that you are not only an outstanding intellectual, a real public intellectual in the true sense, but I think, Musa, that people will look back to this era and they will say that this book in particular actually changes the course of American intellectual history. I dare to say that. I don't know who all's going to read it and who will cancel you for it, because you will make enemies on the right and you will make enemies on the left. But I think there's a lot of us who actually, I can give you a little ray of hope here. When you read something that happens to be true, it rings a bell, and it's like, God damn it. I don't care where this fits. He said something that actually mirrors reality as I understand it. And that's the best I can say about your book. I think you're in Alexis de Tocqueville for our time. And I think this book is really important. So we will do everything in our power to promote it. It's going to be in our November selection for our book club. If you have people you think we ought to interview, please don't go away when I say goodbye now. Stay and talk to Ernie.
Yes.
Maybe someone you want to come back with as part of a panel to talk about your book or their book or something. I would love to have you back, because we've just scratched the surface. I'm so frustrated. I've cut and pasted so many quotes from your book that we didn't get to. but I can recommend this to anyone and just say it's highly accessible. It's brilliant work. The scale of this book should not be in the American context where we're so provincial and we're so narrow. This is on a different scale. I'm glad you start with the Frenchman because you write like a good French intellectual. It's sort of, you're looking at the whole picture for posterity, not just to be cool for this moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really great book, and I just am privileged to have read it.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, and yeah, I'd be happy to stay on and talk some more and maybe come back later.
Talk to Ernie, set it up. Please come back. We have a lot to discuss. My heart is in my mouth about the coming election. That's a different thing. But if we've ever needed sane voices that tell the truth, it's now, whatever our politics. And I would urge anybody who considers himself a conservative, a Christian, an atheist, a liberal, I don't care where you're coming from, if you have any shred of objectivity left in your mind, you are going to eat this book up and love it. So please, please read. Please read We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions, a New Elite of a New Elite, and it'll be published October 8. I think you can pre-order your copy already. I can't recommend it highly enough. So thanks a lot, Musa.
Thank you.